Autism definitely really impacted my childhood because I found it really hard to make friends and I was really longing for friendship. And when I did have it, I'd sort of become really obsessive around finally having connection. So I always sort of felt a bit alone. I used a lot of ketamine and that was really damaging to my body. My stomach, my bladder are just fucked. Like my stomach was scarred. And my sort of solution to fixing that pain that I'd get was to start injecting heroin. I can trust my intuition when I am connected to this power and feel free to, to live my life.
Hello and welcome to 12 Steps and 12 Questions. My name is Silvio and I'm an addict. This pod is full of personal and inspirational stories of recovery from addiction. And in every episode I'll ask each guest the same 12 questions about their life, addiction and recovery. Quick warning, there will be some graphic descriptions and a healthy amount of swearing. For this episode, please welcome Ruairí. Ruairí, thank you so much for being my guest today on this new edition of 12 Steps and 12 Questions. Before we get to your introduction, I would just very quickly like to thank everybody who's downloaded the podcast. I'm really grateful. And I'd be super grateful if you could quickly give us a review on whichever platform you're listening to. It really helps spreading the message and getting it out to people. So I'd be grateful if you could do that. Ruairí, hi.
Hello.
Would you like to introduce yourself quickly?
Yes, hi, my name is Ruairí. I'm 21 years old. My pronouns are they, them, and I'm a recovered drug addict.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ruairí. Let's get straight to it. Question one, which is, did you have any adverse childhood experiences?
I feel like my childhood was actually fairly normal. I had little traumas, I suppose, here and there, but I guess kind of everyone I know also has experiences like that. Although I did actually struggle a lot with my mental health. I've had psychosis ever since I can remember, since being in nursery. I'd see things. I'm also autistic, but I wasn't diagnosed till I was an adult. So it was a huge learning process growing up for my parents to try and understand how to deal with these coping mechanisms that I'd have, like having meltdowns, and they didn't really understand what to do. And then it kind of left a difficult mark on my growing up, I suppose. When I was around 7 or 8, I think I tried to run away from home. I didn't get very far. I packed a little suitcase. It was a 101 Dalmatian suitcase. It was like a foot big. It was tiny. And I left and we lived in this square. And I got to the exit gate and my next door neighbour just sent me back home. And that was as far as I ever got with that. But, autism definitely really impacted my childhood because I found it really hard to make friends. And I was really longing for friendship. And when I did have it, I'd sort of become really obsessive around finally having connection. And, that ended up sort of pushing people away from me eventually. So I always sort of felt a bit alone. There's sort of things that I would blame my using on in the future. But I've learned that I don't believe it has anything to do with why I'm an addict,
Yeah. It sounds as if, it's clear that you really struggled, when you were a kid, and when we're children, really young like that. I often ask about awareness, when we're a bit older, when we're 14, 15 and things, but obviously when you're a child, you have no awareness at all. So things happen to you, don't they, rather than you feeling that you have any agency in them. So if you put yourself back into those shoes, what did that feel like for you, really?
It was very isolating because I was very confused my whole life why I would do certain things, why people didn't want to be around me. That led me to self-harming at a really young age as well. And anxiety was just a constant because all of these things was happening around me and to me as well. And it was things that I had no coping mechanisms to deal with. So I sort of turned to self-harming when I was around 13.
It sounds as if you were troubled from really early on, but you find there is no cause for that?
I think some people just have mental illnesses, and I'm one of those people. Possibly genetics, probably genetics. It runs in my family. I've got 4 siblings. All of us are diagnosed autistics and other neurodivergencies. And a lot of the time they go hand in hand with other like different mental illnesses as well. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So you say you have 4 siblings. What was your relationship like to them? So my older sibling and the one after me, we were always very close. As we, in age as well, we were very close in age, so that brought us together. We kind of grew apart over time, but for a while I shared a bedroom with my older sibling. Even throughout my using as well, there was just a bookcase that divided us. But I tried to... It's a bit difficult to talk about because me and my older sibling, we grew apart, but I knew that I could always depend on them. I took an overdose to try and end my life when I was 17, and they were who I told about it. It's like when I was 13, I set fire to the bathroom, and I went to my older sibling and, hey, I've set fire to the bathroom, and they were like, oh, don't worry, I'll deal with it. So me and my older sibling are very close, and the younger ones now, there is a bit of an age gap. But
so they were literally there to put the fires out. So
yes, exactly.
Yeah, I get it. Yeah, absolutely. And sort of, this is something that because in my own family, while it kind of looked normal, what I do always remember is the atmosphere in the house. It's always really tense, or mostly really tense, right? There was a lot of arguing. It was quite a loud household, right, where I come from. Being Italian by birth obviously doesn't really help with that. But there was also a lot of tension always around the house. It was always quite tense. Was it the same for you, or a different kind of household?
You know what? Some days there were definitely tension. But you've made me remember me and this older sibling of mine. When we were younger, we did have a lot of fights. We would scrap a lot. Yeah. And my mum implemented this rule where if my older sibling threw a toy at me, which was a really common occurrence, then that toy would then belong to me.
Oh, wow.
And well, it worked for a while, but then what I started to do was egg him on, like, go on, throw a toy, go on, do it. And then I'd have like all of my older siblings' toys, and he'd be left without none.
Yeah. Now, with all this setup, with the struggles with mental illness and the autism and so on and so forth, how did you get on at school?
I was very bright in school. I definitely thrived in an educational environment, but I went to a secondary school which was very high pressure. It was very intense. It really affected my anxiety. And it got to the point where I dropped out of school when I was 13 before I took any exams, just because it was far too intense for me. I felt very anxious. The self-harming was getting worse, and I had these suicidal thoughts very frequently. So we made the decision for me and my mum made the decision for me to come out of school. All my other siblings were homeschooled at this point, so I sort of joined in with them. Yeah. But then I got bored and wanted to take exams, so I went to a college and tried to do it there.
Yeah. So here you are, you're about 13 or so, and it kind of brings us to our next question, which is, what did the fun times look like, the good times when you first got hooked? Now, obviously there's a bit of a caveat there, because not everybody has them in that way, and sometimes, especially with behavioral stuff rather than with drugs and alcohol, there isn't necessarily a fun time. But let's just roll with it here. I mean, at some point, either a behavior or drugs or something or alcohol were introduced into your life. How did you get on with that?
Yeah, well, I did have fun times. They didn't last very long for me. I think because I wasn't using drugs for very long compared to a lot of people. It was only around 7 years. But, you know, I said that I
it's a third of your life, though, probably.
Okay, yeah, that's true.
Just what now?
So I left school and I went to this college to take my GCSEs. I was around like a completely new group of people. The school before it was a girls' school. It was very strict. It was a Christian school, and we'd have to go for like mass, and our local church was Westminster Abbey.
Oh, wow.
It was like very strict, and that sort of way. And I went to this college in South London, and it was really, really relaxed. So I started drinking in class, and I had a fun time. It was great. I failed some of my exams because of it, but this was around the time that I found weed as well, and I was the person who would come into class and like give people weed, give people alcohol. We sat one of our exams, and the whole exam hall stank of weed, and like because I was this, you know, this young. Then I suppose I was this young girl who had just come from this like really amazing Westminster school, like really bright. No one assumed it was me, but all my friends knew, and I finally got that sort of connection that I was looking for.
Yeah.
Because I was giving people drugs and giving people alcohol, and I had this group of friends, and I don't know if it was real or if it was because they also just wanted the drugs, but that I suppose was sort of fun times.
And how did it progress from there? You had some good times. That was mainly, you said, with drink and weed. And then at some point, I assume harder stuff was... I mean, we met in Cocaine Anonymous, so I'm assuming harder stuff at some point came into the equation.
Yeah, they did. I started a job when I was 15 or 16. I can't really remember. But... there was quite a big using culture around there. A lot of people drinking and using cocaine. And I got into a relationship with a guy I'll call Charlie, which fits.
Yep.
And he was really abusive. He did not like me drinking. He hated it. I was only allowed to drink if he gave me the alcohol, which looking back it doesn't sound great. Because his actions with me it caused a lot of trauma, that relationship. And so as soon as I was in that relationship, my using became just to escape reality. I wasn't using for fun anymore. I found some cocaine that he had and I used it, and then it helped a lot. And cocaine really wasn't my favourite drug. I actually didn't like it at all. But it gave me a sense of ease and comfort still somehow. And, very quickly that I moved on from sniffing cocaine to sniffing ketamine, taking pills, and so on to, being in some sordid places, taking crack and heroin at age however.
Yeah. At very young and
a young age, yeah.
Did you, we kind of spoke a little bit about awareness earlier. Did you, how old are you here? 15, 16, 17 maybe, right? Do you have any awareness about what you were doing, what it was doing for you, that drugs and alcohol were doing something for you you couldn't do yourself? How did you feel about this?
I was completely unaware. I have a little story to explain that. So at age 17, this is when we went into lockdown, and I was very suicidal, and lockdown made it so I wasn't able to see Charlie at this time, which was amazing, but my mental health was really, really bad. And I took that overdose to try and end my life, and I ended up in a psych ward for the most part of a year. And a couple of weeks ago, I was going through some stuff in storage, and I found some of these psych ward notes and papers that they'd written. And one of them says, Rory seems to be unaware that the effects drug and alcohol have on their mental health. And I completely was unaware the whole time. And I didn't even know it was helping me feel better or making me feel worse. I was just kind of doing it all the time because it was like I had nothing else to do. I didn't know what else to do. I think it was just another coping mechanism at this point. I'm not sure at which point I became powerless to not do it.
Yeah.
But it was probably soon after this time, I think.
The reason why I ask is if I look back at, so for me it became distressing later in life than it did for you, right? I was in my early 20s when it really started, the drugs and the alcohol really got to me, right? So beforehand though, in the fun times, I thought of myself as being quite cool. I was quite rock and roll. I'd bring life, soul and all sorts of other things to the party. Yeah, I just thought of them as being accoutrements to a colourful personality, if you will, right? Rather than thinking of them as things that I needed to get by, which really they were, right? Mm-hmm. I'm just wondering whether you also had this sort of slight personality there, where you were kind of like, oh, I'm a cool chick, I'm quite rock and roll, that sort of thing, or whether that was never really on the agenda.
I think I did have that a bit, actually. Even when it got really, really bad and my using was really damaging, I think it actually, that feeling of being this like rock and roll type person, everything's grand, I think that feeling increased as my using got worse. I didn't want to face the reality of life as I was living it. So I'd be in the worst state imaginable on a clock trying to get something just to feel okay. But it's like, oh, it's fine. Sex, drugs, rock and roll. When really it's just drugs and overdoses and more clocks and that cycle of just living that life. And it wasn't grand at all. But I did lie to myself, definitely, and pretend it was that way, and lie to other people for sure, and tell them I'm fine, I'm doing great.
Looking at it now, in hindsight, do you know what it was that it did for you that you couldn't do for yourself at that time?
Well, I couldn't do anything, I don't think. I was awful at living life. I didn't want to face the reality of anything. Drugs did for me everything. I was no longer suicidal. It gave me this fix to all my problems. It's like, how could I ever want to kill myself? Like, I found this thing, I'm living to use, and that's it. And it solved absolutely everything in my life, I think. Yeah.
It progressed then, didn't it? Our question 3 is, what were your worst consequences? And finally, your rock bottom. The usual caveat, not everybody has a rock bottom, and so on and so forth. I think we've heard it often enough now. You just said that you were on a clock, so at some point you were physically dependent.
Mm-hmm.
So how did it all progress from there?
It happened very quickly. It honestly feels like, 1 week I was just smoking weed and drinking with friends, and then really not long after, in a space of a few months, I was injecting drugs. I started injecting ecstasy before I started injecting heroin. The drug dealer, he come to me and he gave me this, in a baggie, this big fat rock. It was like a yellow golden colour. I'm like, what's this? And he's like, it's for free, have it. I'm like, what is it? And he said, it's ecstasy. Well, he said, it's Diz. I'm like, well, what the fuck is Diz? He said, it's ecstasy. And I asked him, how do I take it? And he goes, well, just get a bit, crush it up and mix it with water and then drink it. So I couldn't wait for him to leave. I went inside, I crushed it up and I mixed it with water. And I'm like, I don't want to drink this. I'm going to find another way to get it into my system. And that was when I started injecting ecstasy. So I feel like I was hooked on needles before I was hooked on the actual substance I was injecting.
I find this fascinating. First time I've ever heard of this, that anyone would inject ecstasy, but then that's just me maybe living under a rock, I don't know. But I also find it fascinating that am I getting this right? By yourself, you thought of, actually, I could inject, and then you injected.
Yes, well, it was a big learning curve for me to try and inject. There was no harm reduction. I had no idea how to inject. The first time I tried to inject, I had no needles, no syringes, but I had piercing needles because I do piercings sometimes. And I had a Calpol syringe downstairs in the kitchen drawer. And I tried to sort of MacGyver it together and like with a lighter melt this Calpol syringe and stick this giant 16 gauge needle into this syringe and try and get it into these floppy little veins. And it did not work. It was painful. I felt so sick. And then I found out about needle exchange and stuff like that. But still, I had no idea how to safely inject drugs, and it caused a lot of problems for me.
I mean, apart from the fact that it just sounds absolutely horrific, this experience of, what did you say, MacGyver, the needle? Yeah. I mean, oh God, right? But apart from that, I just find it fascinating that by yourself, you come up with this idea. Nobody introduced you to injecting.
I'd seen people do it. There was a period of my time when I was 16, I was sex working in these basically crack houses sort of places, and I'd seen people inject before. I'd had a lot of cannulas put in by doctors for my physical health problems, so I kind of followed their leads.
Right, okay. Well, you just said earlier that you were more, I'm paraphrasing, so forgive me if I get this wrong, but that you were, before you were addicted to drugs, you were almost addicted to needles. Did I get that right? Did I understand that correctly?
Before I was addicted to heroin,
yeah.
I want to say, like, I felt every time I went to inject something, I'd inject anything. I tried injecting alcohol. I tried injecting ketamine into my veins when it's meant to go in your muscle. I really liked putting things into my vein, and then it would be anything I could get my hands on, you know, and then it became injecting heroin, injecting crack. Like,
what did the injecting do for you as opposed to snorting? Let me just come out with this right away here. It sounds weird, but it is true. I am to some degree, the cocaine addiction was also an addiction to snorting, right? Something about the act of snorting, about the whole ritual, of course, of racking up a line and so on and so forth, and then having this go into my nose. And then I enjoyed, as weird as it is, but it is true, I enjoyed that sensation of it going up my nose and then dropping back down, you know, and so on and so forth. So there was quite a bit of almost physical enjoyment in that, which sounds weird to normal people, I'm sure, but it is that way. So is there something similar for you in terms of injecting?
Yeah, for sure. There was something very ritualistic about getting everything ready, putting this syringe there, needle there, put it in, do that, cook that, all of that, getting it into the barrel, finding a vein, which was the worst part, but it was still part of the process. That it might be because of my autism, but I definitely enjoyed the repetitive process and this sort of ritual of setting everything up and getting it into my veins. And also, obviously, the fact that definitely my experience was that injecting drugs gave me a much stronger, more intense high than snorting it, you know.
Cool. I think rituals are, I mean, I think even all the research and things points into that direction, that rituals are a huge part of addiction, you know. So this is not unfamiliar or unexpected, I suppose. A needle addiction is something that, you know, doesn't get spoken about that much, or hasn't been spoken about that much on this podcast, perhaps.
I mean, I feel like for me, it might be important to clarify that I don't think I was powerless over needles.
No.
I was powerless over drugs, but there was definitely, I do feel like I was I mean, there's a difference between addiction and powerlessness in my eyes. But I was very fascinated by the idea of injecting drugs and then doing it. And I became definitely hooked on taking drugs that way instead of like drinking alcohol. It's like, let me just see if it will work, if I can get it into my veins. Bad idea.
The act of injecting all sorts of stuff, as you said, I mean, you injected alcohol and ketamine and all the rest of it, it does suggest to me that there's quite a lot to the fact that you want to inject, right? Because usually, I suppose, if you're hooked on heroin, you don't inject alcohol.
Well, if I couldn't get my hands on what I wanted, I'm going to use something else anyway. And if I'm going to use something else, let's just see if I can get a more intense high from it by injecting it. You know, and
How did it then? I take it progressed into full-blown heroin addiction.
So I'd used it periodically throughout not all my using, like for maybe the last 3 years a minute. But I never got a habit. I don't think I did. I was using a lot of substances at once and just whatever was there. And then I'd gotten a bit of clean time and then relapsed. And this was when the heroin addiction got really bad. I actually didn't have any intention of going and getting drugs, and I met some guy outside East Croydon station, and we was talking. He was a fellow junkie. You could just tell. We was talking about tattoos, and all of a sudden, the thought came into my mind, and I asked him, "Do you know I can get some gear?" And straight away, we were off and running. We went to meet this little group of junkies there. One of them came with us, and then we went up a hill, met some other people. People would be like, one person would come from these little groups, and we'd go up to this hill, wait for a car to come, keep waiting. Oh, there's another car, not that one. Wait for the car to stop, and then one of us would go and get the gear for all of us. And that was just a really repetitive cycle every single day during the time that I relapsed. And it was never that bad before I got clean, I suppose, the first time. It was just kind of use whatever I can when I can.
No. So if we remember the question maybe a little bit, which is, what were your worst consequences and finally your rock bottom? So clearly things have progressed to a point that was difficult. What did that look like, and how did it progress?
I had definitely a lot of consequences in a very short amount of time. Many ongoing physical health problems. Like, I used a lot of ketamine, and that was really damaging to my body. It's my stomach, my bladder are just fucked. Like, my stomach was scarred, and it was really, really painful to keep on using ketamine. And my sort of solution to fixing that pain that I'd get was to start injecting heroin. So that's sort of when I started doing that, and it kind of helped. I didn't have as much pain, and I got really high, but it ended up causing a lot more problems than it solved. I think the worst thing that happened, physically the worst thing that happened, was I took a lot of heroin and a lot of benzos, and I didn't really like benzos, but I took a lot of them with a lot of heroin and a lot of cocaine, many things combined at once, and it sent me into a coma at my place of work after hours. And
if you're enjoying this podcast and would like other addicts and alcoholics to hear it, then please make the pesky AIs and algorithms work their 12th step. Hit like and subscribe.
I don't remember what happened in the hospital or even coming out of the hospital, but 1 second I'm using, the next second I'm in a cab with my mum, and I ask her where we're going. She says, we're going home. You were in a coma, and she sort of shut me in this room for ages, and I still managed to get out and use, like it was seeing the desperation of my family for me to stop, You know, I've got younger siblings. My dad's a police officer. I put his job on the line a lot. They were just so hopeless. I was withdrawing one time in the bathroom. It was really late at night, crying my eyes out, and I was having these ketamine cramps in my stomach as well, which is honestly the worst pain I could ever imagine. Like, I've nearly died several times, and these K cramps were worse than anything. But my parents had convinced me, I think, to give them my drugs, or they took it. I don't remember clearly, but in the middle of the night, my parents come into the bathroom and see me hunched over on the bathroom floor with my head in the toilet bowl, just in agony. And I remember my mum saying to me, "Are drugs worth this?" And then my dad saying, "Should we just give them back the drugs, because I can't look at this?" You know, and that broke my heart. They didn't end up giving them back to me, which broke my heart even more. But, you know, it's like the book talks about this, frothy emotional appeal seldom suffices, you know. Yeah. It was really hard to see what I was doing to my family. I didn't see it really at the time, but I was told that I traumatized my family, and I couldn't believe it. I'm like, no, all I do is use drugs. I'm not hurting anyone. This has nothing to do with you. But it's stuff that I really had to look at, you know. And
to the alcoholic, his life only seems the only normal one.
Yeah, can't differentiate the truth from the false. Yeah.
Yeah. So would you describe this as the point of no return, where you decided you wanted to get clean, or were there other bits?
I wanted the consequences to stop, for sure. So you know, before this horrible relapse and the coma and all the overdoses, I'd taken the steps before, but not honestly. I didn't ever actually want to stay stopped. I'd hear people talking about relapse. I'm like, oh, when's this going to happen for me? When am I going to get to relapse? Get to relapse,
yeah.
You know, so I don't count that. I feel like it wasn't an honest shot at it. But, you know, I made the decision to go to rehab after, you know, this awful relapse. And it was really just because I wanted to keep on using, but I couldn't keep on using if I was going to die. And I was overdosing a lot. I'm like, shit, I'm going to die. If I die, I can't use anymore. Let's go get some help. And in the treatment centre, I still managed to use in there, you know. And then, yeah, I had an awful time, but...
Yeah. Our question 4 is, did you ever want to die, consider suicide? Now, by the sound of it, and I hope you don't mind me saying this, you were sort of living on the edge for quite a while in many, many ways, by the sound of it.
For a long time, definitely, especially when I was in that abusive relationship I spoke about, and I was in the psych wards and stuff like that. But I feel like my mental health and my using were parallel with each other. I don't think one was caused by the other necessarily. I did try to kill myself quite a few times, but it got to a point, I think, when around the time I became powerless over drugs, that I stopped wanting to kill myself. I stopped wanting to die, because this was giving me a reason to live. You know, despite all the consequences. And that was like why I wanted to go to treatment. Like I said, I didn't want to die anymore. I wanted to keep on using, and it was giving me this sense of fulfillment that I was, you know, desperately searching for my entire life. Even if that fulfillment was just satisfying this craving that my body has.
Yeah, you know? Yeah. I think only a drug addict can really understand that sort of reasoning. I think it's way too much for the normies out there. And I don't mean that in a bad way or anything. It's just, as we were saying, you know, to the alcoholic or the addict, you know, his life seems the only normal one.
Yeah.
Really interesting. Question 5 is, what other methods did you try to get sober before finding the rooms?
Fuck all. I was one of them. I didn't try anything. Like I said, it was because I didn't ever actually want to stop using. Other people tried many things to try and get me to stop.
All right, okay.
None of them worked. Like I said, my mum trying to lock me in the house. She was like, I'm not letting you out of my sight until you're locked up in rehab. I'm like, yeah, all right, that sounds good. Still used in a treatment centre. People would beg me to stop, and they could see the progression clear as day. But for me, I thought everything was fine. So I was enjoying what I was doing. So I thought, and I didn't actually want to stop. And it wasn't until I was in this treatment centre and I'd been using, someone had been giving me pregabalin and some benzos, and I'd been using them because I was dishonest about what I was using because my dad was sitting next to me when I was first admitted into this rehab. So they decided not to give me a detox for heroin. It was my own fault. I had a massive resentment to the rehab for not giving me a detox, but then I realised, oh, this was my doing. I lied about what I was using because I didn't want my dad to know, oh yeah, I'm using heroin, even though he already knew. But yeah, so this guy was giving me these drugs, but in my mind, I'm like, oh, these aren't drugs, it's fine to take. But then one day I sort of realised, confessed to start off what I did, and then I had this experience in my room, sort of like a step 1, 2, 3 experience together. I fully conceded my powerlessness. It's like, well, I can't even get clean in rehab. What's going to happen back in the real world, I suppose? And I begged God for help. I was on my knees, sobbing my heart out, sobbing my eyes out. And I, without reservation, asked for help and said, God, I'll do anything. And then I realised I actually did want to stop and stay stopped. But, a couple days passed and I was in hospital for seizures, and I left the place and went and drank. Because there was no action put into place. It was a 12-step rehab, but it's sort of different to what we do in the rooms, with the sponsor.
Yeah. Our question 6 is, did you struggle with the word God? So when you came in, eventually you did come to a 12-step group, obviously. And when you first got in, did you struggle with the word God?
Yes, when I first came into a 12-step meeting, I was just very confused why people were talking about God and what sort of role God had in this program. I had no idea people were going to be talking about God. And I was sitting in this room and a woman come up to me at the end of my first ever meeting and she said, "You need God." I'm like, fuck off, crazy religious woman. So I was really confused about what you guys did in these rooms. The only assumptions I had was media representations of AA meetings, which are, they seem dark and gloomy, people complaining about their lives and how difficult it is to be an alcoholic. And I was expecting that. And then people were really happy. I'm like, okay, cool, I suppose. And people talk about God. I'm like, no, I don't understand. I really didn't get it. But that being said, I've always believed in God. I went to that Christian school. I went to church for a long time. But when I was around 17 years old, I didn't stop believing in God, but I definitely lost faith in God because, I was struggling a lot with my mental health and drinking and stuff like that. And I thought, what kind of God would let me go through this? But then, when I did take the steps and look at step 2, I had to look at these assumptions I had about God.
Yeah.
And then I was told it could be a higher power of my own understanding, which was very intriguing to me.
Yeah.
My sponsor told me, take a look at what you think God is, and is it a God that's been impressed upon you by other people, or is it something that you believe in and understand, And that really helped me, because the idea that I had of God was definitely something that had been impressed upon me. When I heard that this was a spiritual program and I heard people talking about God, I thought it's like, oh, is it like Hail Marys, or do we like sing Kumbaya? I really didn't understand, and people were talking about their own conceptions of God, and it was fascinating to me. And still today I don't have this well-rounded definition of what God is for me, but I 100% believe in this power that has saved me.
Yeah. This idea that we'd have to believe in a God that we were told about by others rather than bring our own, BYOG, right, is something that was so relevant to me when I first came in as well, that because I come in also from this, I'd come in from having in one way or another rejected what I was told beforehand, and very mixed message upbringing around God. There was always this sort of like, well, Jesus died for you kind of thing going on and stuff, and I really didn't, it made me feel weird and almost blamed for something I'd had no concept of and so on, and that I could just get rid of all of that. It had nothing to do with it had no place in my recovery. That was really what turned it around for me, actually, in the end. Question 7 is, how do you experience your higher power today? Also a good place to share any God moments if you want to.
I experience my higher power today constantly in really little things. It could be as simple as just not being a complete dick to everyone I'm around, because that was my default when I was using. And now it's like I've noticed myself thinking of others and being kind of like, that's not Rory. This is something else working through me, But I've had a lot of, I suppose, God moments, or these spiritual experiences or spiritual awakenings. And some have been these experiences that just fill me completely with love and with God's presence around me, and it's wonderful. Some have been ugly. I've had to face some ugly truths about myself. Each, I think, are beautiful and vital for my recovery as well. And each of those experiences have just brought me closer and closer to this higher power. I see God in my life today as something that I can depend on. Like step 11 in the big book, it talks about facing indecision. When we face indecision, we ask for inspiration and we don't struggle. I feel like that's where my life is now, I can trust my intuition when I'm connected to this power, and feel free to, to live my life and having this, if I wake up in the morning, I get connected to this power, I feel freedom, and I can sort of trust what I'm going to do, the next action that I'm going to do if I do stay connected throughout the day.
Yeah. It's a wonderful way of expressing that, actually. Our question 8 is, which parts of the steps were the most difficult for you? So anything that you struggled with in particular?
I think definitely step 1 was quite difficult for me. I'd been told by absolutely everyone around me, Rory, you're a drug addict, which, I like, yeah, of course I am, look at me. But I didn't understand powerlessness. I didn't know what it meant to be a drug addict. I was coming to meetings for a while before getting a sponsor, and I was trying on my own to understand powerlessness and identify with it, but I just couldn't, because everyone was telling these stories about all the times they tried to stop using but couldn't do it, and I'd never tried to stop before. And I heard about this term, a mental blank spot, and people saying like, oh yeah, I'd always think it will be different this time, or they don't remember how bad it was. I'm like, no, I know if I take this hit, I'm probably going to overdose. I know. And I know all the terrible consequences, but I'm still going to do it anyway. And that in itself is powerlessness, you know?
Yeah.
My sponsor explained to me, like, you know, the insanity of using when, yeah, the most insane thing to do in this moment is use, and you do it anyway. And really just broke it down very simply of mental and physical, having no choice but to use and no control over my using. And then I'm like, right, that is me. And then I understood step 1. Another one was step 5. That was a little bit difficult. I feel like everything sort of after step 3, you know, maybe wasn't difficult because I just kind of like, all right, I've made this decision in step 3. I'm going to stick to it. I'm just going to keep going.
Yeah.
But I did need courage for this step 5 especially. Not the part about talking to my sponsor, because he sort of knew most things anyways, I think. But I worked so hard on getting this relationship back with God. Like, is God ever going to forgive me when I admit all these things to God? Like, what is going to happen? But, you know, my experience is that God is forgiving, and I have been forgiven. And, you know, it's like this moving to step 6, it was so easy. You know, it's like looking at what I've learned in steps 4 and 5. Am I willing to change? Yes, all right, God's forgiven me. I was so scared to take that step, but it was very freeing to actually get it done.
Yeah. And what a powerful message that is, I think. Step 5, I think most people, or many people I've spoken to, and probably including myself, you know, a bit embarrassed about admitting all those things to another person, right? But admitting them to a higher power and hoping that we'll still be loved, really, yeah, that we're actually still good people, we still belong to the human race,
Yeah.
right? It's such a big deal, that. Yeah, fascinating. Question 9 is, which character defects give you most trouble?
I feel fear comes up for me quite a lot. Self-centered fears of how do people see me? How am I presenting myself to other people? It's something that does come up quite frequently in my nightly reviews. It's definitely been present throughout my whole life, self-centered fears. But through working the steps, it's for sure reduced the amount of fear I have in my life, you know. But I am human, and these, like, I feel I can be a bit judgmental sometimes as well. And it's like these manifestations of self, they will come back throughout my whole life. But it's just about, you know, addressing it appropriately and turning it over to God. But fears, they are present. So when I'm asked to do a share, or like you asked me to come here, I'm like, oh, how are people going to see me? Am I going to carry a message? Am I going to help someone? I was like, it's okay. I just have to remind myself, I'm free now. I don't need to be scared. I don't need to judge anyone. I don't need to be resentful, because I'm free. That's it. Like if all of those things are just like self-will coming back, which I don't need and I don't want, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. Question 10, what's the best thing recovery has given you?
So many things. It's really hard to have like a few best things. It's like all those predictions that it says in the big book. They're all coming true. They're all coming to life for me.
You mean the step 9 promises?
Well, there's so many predictions all throughout the book, but for sure, including the step 9 promises. It's like with the fear of people and of economic insecurity will leave us. Man, I do not have money. Like, I have economic insecurity, but there is no fear around it for me. And it's like in the chapter A Vision for You, I have met people on a common journey, this fellowship of the spirit, you know, and being able to work with others and use my experience to help someone else. It's baffling to me every single day. I wake up and one of the first thoughts I get is how drastically my life has changed, but also how I'm now able to help others. And these sort of, another thing is the living amends that I'm able to make to my family and those around me is wonderful to be back in my family's life. It's my little brother's birthday soon, and I got a text saying I've been invited to feed the ducks with him, and I'm really excited for that. It's really the little things in my life. Well, that's not even a little thing, it's huge. I get to spend that day with my family, you know, and just having something I can rely on, this power to fall back on, you know, when things get intense. I have a power greater than me, you know. I don't have to manipulate these outcomes anymore.
Yeah.
I'm no longer foolishly burning up energy trying to run the show myself. That is probably one of the biggest gifts that recovery has brought me. It's just I can take it easy now. I don't need to stress. And I've got friends with me and family with me who are just supportive, and, you know, I never ask for forgiveness, but I've been forgiven by so many people for what I've done, and it's very nice to know.
I think it's really hard to understate how big a deal that is. You know, not being that person anymore who tears everything down, brings the carnage. You know, you were speaking earlier about how you could see the pain that you were causing in your family's life and stuff, and not being that person anymore, but contributing to things rather than tearing them down is such a huge difference, such a turnaround for us.
Yeah, it's like thinking now of what I can give rather than what I can take. You know, I feel the joy I get from helping other people and just giving and thinking of others and not thinking of myself all the time and getting stuck in like self-pity, self-centered fears. So I don't need to do that anymore. You know?
Yeah. Our next question is, what would you say to a newcomer or someone wondering if they're an addict?
I feel like I'm going to give a very basic answer to this question just because I was shown the steps through the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous. And there's a whole chapter called Working with Others. And it gives us pretty clear directions on how to approach someone who's new, you know. So I would hopefully have a conversation with them if I can and, you know, sort of share my experience similar to how I've done here and, you know, talk about this lack of thinking before you even pick up and what precedes that. But then also I'd want to definitely tell them what, you know, if they identify, tell them what sobriety can look like, and that we're not boring and glum, and it's not tedious, and it's, you know, sobriety it's given me so much more than I ever expected. It's given me back so much more than what I lost through my using. I'd for sure want to emphasize that this is what's on offer, and it's really amazing and really beautiful, and you can have a life that you couldn't even imagine. You know, it's not that difficult to do. It's like, you know, I feel like I do so little to get so much in return. And it's a wonderful thing. I want everyone to have it, you know?
Yeah. One of the reasons why I used a lot and I drank a lot and partied a lot is because I wanted a life less ordinary, right? I thought it was, you know, all about excitement and, a life less ordinary, really, you know. And had someone said to me, well, if you do all of this, you do the step round so you can lead a normal life, I'd have probably run a mile. And I think we don't really lead, in that respect, normal lives. If there is even such a thing, I just find that our lives are filled with so much meaning and purpose and beauty and joy.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's really what's on offer.
I for sure don't live a normal life. Like, I've got this relationship back with my family, and they're obviously curious as to what I do and what's changed and why I am the way I am now. And I tell them, it's like, well, this is sort of what I did, and this is what I do now, and I help others, and I work with other drug addicts who are struggling, and that's pretty much what I do all day. I don't have a job, but I'm very privileged to have a lot of time to go out and go to meetings and meet newcomers, and they're like, how do you do, like, you spend your whole life with drug addicts? How are you sober? I'm like, well, it's recovered, isn't it?
Yeah. That's beautiful. That's amazing. Last question. What do you want your higher power to say to you, quote unquote, at the pearly gates?
This, I feel like I actually have no idea because I feel like I've met God already many times throughout this journey of recovery. Maybe this is going to sound very strange to anyone who's not in the rooms or not in recovery, but the best part of my life today is sort of helping others and doing what I'm doing, working with other addicts. I'm like, I don't expect there to be struggling addicts in heaven or wherever we go, but it's like, I'd kind of like an opportunity to keep on doing what I'm doing.
Yeah.
Or maybe you're welcome, because I'm going to thank God so much.
That's beautiful. Thank you. I have to thank you so much, Rory, for being here, for being my guest on 12 Steps and 12 Questions. It was brilliant. You brought so much honesty and courage to this, and that is not little. It really isn't. It's a big deal. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. It was grand, honestly.
Brilliant. We're still rolling. That was great. Thank you so much.
Huzzah. That was lovely.
Did you feel that you said everything you wanted to say, or did you leave it all on the field?
I think I said everything I wanted to say. I feel like I had some notes. I didn't say all the notes. I'm like,
anything that sticks out from those notes that you really think should be in there? Okay, good, excellent. Brilliant. I think it was really wonderful. It's so great to hear your message. And as I said, you brought so much courage and so much joy to this. It was brilliant. Thank you again.
We've come to the end of this episode. Thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed it and would like other addicts and alcoholics to hear it, then please make the pesky AIs and algorithms work their 12th step. Hit like and subscribe. While this pod is based on the 12-step recovery program, it's not officially affiliated with any 12-step fellowship. 12 Steps and 12 Questions is not substance or behavior specific, it's fully self-supporting and not-for-profit. And you know this next bit. It's not allied with any sect, denomination, politics, organization or institution. It does not wish to engage in any controversy, and it neither endorses nor opposes any causes.